Everybody, hope you're doing well. I wanted to chime in with a little bit more content from the content minds here on YouTube. I've obviously, like I'm sure we all have, been watching the coverage of former President Trump's indictment on federal charges in the last week or so here, and one of the interesting sort of memes that's taken off in the media that I wanted to critique a little bit from an international studies perspective and from a political science perspective is this idea that we're seeing tossed around a lot, that this is a really, this is a dark day in the history of the United States. And one of the closely tied concepts to this is that somehow the indictment on federal charges of a former head of state is indicative, and I'll use this term here and then critique it a bit, but is indicative of sort of a third world ness or a third world a characterization of the United States, right? That the indictment of Trump is somehow presaging or indicating a collapse of the American system or a degradation of the American system or the American ideals of government in some way. And I think this is a really dated, and I'm not sure I'd say it's an offensive term necessarily, but it's not a term that serious people in political science or international studies use outside of a historical context, right? So if you hear somebody characterize things this way, it's important to remember that they probably don't have any idea what they're talking about, and they're pushing something more from an ideological perspective than from a real critical analytical perspective. And the reason that it's not a pedantic or sort of academic debate, really for a couple of reasons that I think really tie into this stuff around Trump and what this means for our country, or this country, I should say. The first is really just that, the idea of the third world, when people generally on the right wing of the political spectrum use this term, what they're really trying to indicate is a development difference, right? A difference in development level between the United States and whatever country they're trying to punch down on. And this was never really a one-to-one kind of concept match with the third world term anyway, right? The idea of the third world emerged from sort of, analyses of the bipolar world in the Cold War and the alignment of different countries that weren't, directly aligned with the United States or the Soviet Union. And there was a correlation in development level of those countries and the third world, but it was never a great way to describe differences in development anyway. And it's also just something that no longer accurately describes the global order, right? We now think about things more in a developing country context or developed country context, and even this is a really fraught debate, right? I don't want to defend the idea of development as a perfect one either, but obviously we need some way of categorizing countries based on economic and institutional robustness and success, right? And output, if you're talking about economics. And so this is part of what I think why it's also better to use a term like development instead of the quote unquote third world. If you want to make if you want to do an analysis of does it help or hinder the United States as a political institution to be able to prosecute former heads of state for crimes or potential crimes or alleged crimes. Part of that, we can put aside right away, and I think this is part of the punching down, right? Is we don't need to think about economics here at all. This isn't really a matter of economics. This is a matter of the judicial system, which is really a part of what we would call institutions in social science and political science, international studies. The idea of how robust are institutions in a particular political community. This is one way we measure development. And we do that because it correlates to things like corruption and rule of law. A lot of what makes a state functional beyond the power of the person in charge of that state comes down to institutions. These can be things, government institutions like courts. It can be, civil society institutions like religious organizations. It can be unions. It can, even include things like the press. It can include nonprofits. There's all kinds of things we can think about. I, for example, would categorize something like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center. These are sort of institutions, right? These are things that have the ability to interface with policy making to some degree. They don't necessarily make policy, but they can recommend it. They can lead. Their sort of actions can lead to judicial outcomes that affect policy. And the strength of those things in a country is a big part of what we're getting at when we talk about, a country's development level. And this is really what I want to focus on, because obviously it's not going to shock anybody. I think, given all the other factors we understand to be true about the United States and its institutional development level, something like what's happening with former President Trump right now is much more indicative of strong institutions and thus relatively high development, as opposed to weak institutions and relatively low development. And this gets into sort of wonky social science territory about, we have these ideas around measurement, right? And we have this in all kinds of science, but you have to have a connection between your metric or your measurement and the underlying thing that you care about, the underlying phenomenon that you want to understand. And particularly in social science, this is difficult, right? Because what we want to understand is how productive is a country's economy, for example. So we might measure that with gross domestic product, but that leaves things out, right? It's not a perfect measure. It's one way of getting to that. Or we've all been experiencing the inflation debate, right? And we've learned watching the Fed that there are different ways of measuring, core inflation versus not, and what do you want to include in inflation, and the way you chop that up really determines if the number is a good number or a bad number, right? So it's sort of the damn lies and statistics phenomenon. And this is important for I think what we're talking about here with Trump's indictment, and I'll use a simple kind of metaphor, I think, to explain how I think about this, and the metaphor really is something like, if you've ever tried to get in better shape, right? Maybe you want to lose 5 or 10 pounds or something, and you want to put on some muscle and eat better and get stronger, and whatever, right? New Year's resolution type thing. And you start taking the actions you think will, produce that outcome, and you're measuring your weight every morning or every other morning, and you're noticing that your weight's actually, so you've started lifting 3 or 4 times a week, and you're eating more protein, but you're eating less overall, and I'm going to lose weight. This is going to be great. That number's going to go down, and that's going to reaffirm to me that I'm doing the right thing, right? And then you go and you start weighing yourself, and you're actually gaining weight, right? And it's like very frustrating, and sort of what the hell is going on here. And this is a great kind of metaphor, I think, because as you might learn more about what that process entails, you might learn, muscle actually weighs more than body fat. And so because I'm relatively radically changing my daily habits, I'm putting on some muscle. And so while I'm noticing in the mirror, right, that I'm getting in better shape, my body fat looks like it's going down when I look at myself, or when I do update photos of myself, the number is not going down. It might even be going up. But that doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't working, right? It might actually mean the opposite. And this gets into, even for very simple sort of experiments like this, we can see that measurements can mean multiple things, and they can actually often indicate things that are the opposite of what we think that they might indicate. They can be counterintuitive. And I think this is kind of what's happening in this circumstance, because we can take an example of, I think, as people on the right wing are sort of problematically doing, and they're looking at Latin America or Africa, and they're saying, well, this is reminiscent of a country where a political persona gets out of power, and then his predecessor is not predecessor. The folks following him, the administration that follows the administration that's left power, then uses the levers of power to prosecute them in some way, right? To prevent competition in the political system, and that's sort of the knee-jerk reaction that I think they're having when they talk about a third world country. Again, as cringy as that term is, and this is interesting, right? Because this it could mean that, right? This kind of prosecution or indictment could indicate that kind of thing. But when we look more broadly for better comparisons, I don't think the United States is that reminiscent of a Brazil or another developing country where we have seen things like this happen. I think it's much more indicative when you look at holistically the strength of the development of the United States in terms of its institutions, right? A much more realistic parallel or analog would be a country like France or a country like South Korea. Obviously, these places aren't perfect comparisons, but in these countries, you see repeated examples, right, of a head of state commits crimes while in office or while running for office, and at some point later down the line, the institutions, the judicial system, the press, nonprofits, investigative reporters, right, civil society groups, coalesce to provide evidence for those crimes and support the sort of independent judicial review of those crimes, and civil and criminal consequences can ensue for that person. And when we really step back, I think the Park Geun-hye or the Sarkozy or the Chirac kind of example really indicates, right, that this is not some in a country where we know the institutions to be quite strong. We look at the Department of Justice and we look at the special counsel being completely divorced from. There's no contact between that person and the administration, right? There's no contact between the special counsel and even the head of the DOJ, right? So while I think this kind of prosecution can indeed be a sign of either or, right? Either one of these situations, weak institutions and third worldness, or strong institutions and a more developed country. I think in this case it's quite obvious that it's the latter for the United States, right? Which really makes us question, I think, how dark of a day is this? And I don't mean to take a victory lap here and say that this is a unilaterally great thing for the country. I think people from both sides of the political spectrum have sort of noted that this is a concern, right? This person was in charge of the national security of the United States, and this is an incredibly concerning and serious and dire situation if these allegations are true. But I would not say that if they are true, the person who perpetrated these potential crimes being held accountable for them is a dark day at all, right? It's actually indicative of exactly the kind of development level, the high development level that I think people on the right would hope that this country has and want to. These people want this to be a strong, functional, rule of law based political community, and I think all signs point to that being true in this case to me. All right, given what we know about the institutions of the United States. So that's really what I wanted to say. As always, I really look forward to y'all's comments on this. The comments have been awesome on the videos so far and really have given me a lot to think about. And I'm sure they will be here as well. And I just wanted to say thanks again, as always, for watching. Appreciate it.